This evening's presenter is Les Selby. Les was born and raised in Montreal. He moved to the GTA after university, and he enjoyed a 40-year career in retail management, incentive purchasing, and meetings and special event planning. Although retired, he is still an active volunteer with Meeting Professionals International and with Scouts Canada. Les started collecting stamps at the age of 7, and after 60 years, he still enjoys working on his worldwide collection. But his real philatelic passion is focused on Zeppelins and airship mail. He has exhibited rigid airship material at both the local and national level. He is a member of the American Philatelic Society, the Royal Philatelic Society of Canada, the PSSC, the Canadian Aerophilatelic Society, and both the North Toronto Stamp Club and the Markham Stamp Club. Les also served on the organizing committee for CAPEX 22 and has been on the North Toronto Stamp Club executive since 2013. Les's presentation is going to be on the proving flights of the Graf Zeppelin 1928 to 1931. So Les, take it away.
Thank you. There's a couple of very quick slides with background information, and I will give that to you and then go right into the topic. So Ferdinand Adolf Heinrich August Graf von Zeppelin. He completed the first successful rigid airship flight in Germany in July of 1900. And after 3 flights, they dismantled that ship, which was called LZ-1. And then 4 other ships were constructed over the next 8 years. By 1900, and none of those ships were they were all concurrent. One would be built, it would be flown, it would be dismantled, the next one. So they never had more than one at a time. By 1908, Count Zeppelin had enough financial support from the public and from grants from the government that he could establish Luftschiffbau Zeppelin limited company to produce rigid airships commercially. So then, starting in 1909, Count Zeppelin founded the world's first airline, which is commonly known as DELAG, which used Zeppelins to fly both paying passengers and VIPs on pleasure trips around Germany. They had a succession of Zeppelins, and several times they had 2 or 3 flying at the same time. By July 1914, DELAG's dirigibles had safely transported a total of 34,028 passengers on 15,088 commercial flights. Now, Zeppelin was busy promoting the technology and the idea of airship travel to the nobility and to the military. And so of those 34,000, almost 20,000 of those passengers were free, but they were taking the flights. And they were running flights on a regular basis throughout Germany. With the outbreak of World War I, the German military requisitioned the 3 dirigibles that DELAG had, and that put an end to commercial passenger flights for Zeppelins until after the war. So one of the things you could do to help raise money, they allowed people to tour the Zeppelin works at Friedrichshafen. And this card, which shows a Zeppelin on the other side, has an onboard marking from the Victoria Louise. And it's actually a souvenir from someone's visit to the Zeppelin works. It wasn't actually flown on the airship. Zeppelin made arrangements with the Reichspost to have traveling post offices on 4 of the passenger Zeppelins, and people could mail a card and they would get it stamped right there and handed back to them, and then they could mail it when they landed. So they could send out cards that had been airlifted to their friends and family. So during the war, the Zeppelin company actually manufactured 88 Zeppelins for the Navy and the Air Force for Germany. And they were, at the point of the end of the war, they were producing a new airship every 2 weeks. Count Zeppelin actually passed away in 1917, and Hugo Echner assumed control of the company. So as soon as the war ended, Luftschiffahrts Zeppelin manufactured 2 small airships capable of carrying 28 passengers each and delivered them to DELAG for passenger service. And passenger service was started up on 2 routes almost right away. However, with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles and the conditions imposed, the airline lost both airships to the Allies as war reparations, and the Treaty of Versailles forbid Germany from manufacturing any more aircraft or airships or operating them. So the Zeppelin company actually resorted to making aluminum cookware and other consumer products to stay in business. They wanted to try and maintain the workforce, hoping that the conditions would change. And so they made a lot of aluminum cookware, and if you can find any, it actually has Zeppelin printed on the bottom. In 1923, the United States government was able to, or the United States Navy actually, was able to convince the Allies to permit Germany to build a non-military dirigible for the American naval airship program. Interesting story on that was that the US started manufacturing their own Zeppelins with a joint company between Zeppelin and Goodyear. So they had a company in Akron called the Goodyear Zeppelin Works, and they produced 3 of the American airships. While they were producing number 2, the American Navy was able to buy an airship from England, and they were flying that airship, test training the crew, when it had a structural failure and crashed to the ground, killing most of the US naval personnel who were learning how to operate airships and a number of the British airship crew that were on that ship as well. With the crash of that airship, the US naval program fell into production problems, and so that's why they wanted to get an airship from Germany. The German Zeppelin crews from the war had actually destroyed a number of their airships rather than turn them over to the Allies as they were ordered. And so a lot of money was owed to the Allies as war reparations to replace the material that had been destroyed by the German Air Force, Navy, and military. So the German government was supposed to give the US government $800,000 US to replace the Zeppelin that were destroyed. Instead, Echner was able to convince the US to invest that $800,000 into a brand new German-built Zeppelin. Not only was he able to convince them to do that, but he was actually able to convince them to give him another $50,000 to pay for changes they wanted. So the first airship built after the war, after the 2 small airships, was LZ-126, and it was delivered to the United States in October of 1924. It took 2 years to build, or almost 2 years. And the cover you see on this page was on the delivery flight from Germany to the United States. The Reichspost advertised that there would be mail carried on the flight, and they would take it right up to the delivery in October. They had to put out an announcement after 3 weeks and say they couldn't take any more because they reached their 330-pound delivery limit based on the lifting power. The picture you see on this slide is actually the LZ-126, which became the USS Los Angeles. And they used it with the naval programs, and it is docked on a naval vessel that was converted to be a Zeppelin tower called the Pagoda. So after the delivery of LZ-126 to the US, the European nations met in Locarno, Switzerland, and undertook negotiations, and Germany was allowed to redevelop much of its non-military economy. Hugo Echner wanted to reproduce Zeppelins at the Zeppelin Works in Friedrichshafen, but the Weimar government declined to assist. And they did that for 2 reasons. One is they had no money, The second reason was they were concerned that the Allies might see Zeppelin manufacturing as an attempt to produce weapons again, and they were scared that that would make the Allies impose further sanctions. So what Echner and a number of the other Zeppelin commanders who had flown Zeppelins during the war, they gave hundreds of lectures across Germany and to German-speaking people in neighboring countries, and started a fund called the Zeppelin Echner Spend, or the Zeppelin Echner Fund, and they sold postcards and labels. So at the bottom of this slide, you can see two of the three labels that were produced, and people put them on cards and letters when they mailed them. And then the postcards, you can see there's two, there are a couple of others. And one of these actually says, you know, Echner was not foolish. He was applying to German nationalism. One of them says, a German Zeppelin again? Yes, donate to the fund. So that was how they raised money. And so they were able to raise about a third of the cost of a Zeppelin from these fundraising activities. They got another, about a seventh of the cost from the government that finally broke down to public pressure. And the rest of the money to start construction on a new airship was actually given to the construction from the Zeppelin works that were making cookware and other things not related to airships. So the LZ-127 was designed by Ludwig Durr, and it was a stretch version of the airship that had been delivered to the United States. Because there was no money to do anything other than build the airship, they were limited by the size of the construction shed at Friedrichshafen. And so the shed was 787 feet long, and LZ-127 was designed to be 776 feet long. So there was 11 feet in front and behind the airship between the doors. And then it was 100 feet in diameter, with a gondola hung far forward where the bow started to lift towards the nose so that it could be hung onto the airship without using up much of the space. So you can see there a postcard of the construction of LZ-126. And for those of you that don't know much about Zeppelins, I thought I'd throw this Zeppelin design in from airships.net. So you can see the gondola on the bottom slide way at the front, and that's where your passengers and the command center and communications, everything was. The big airship itself is mostly gas bags with the lifting power, and then some gas bags for fuel as well. There are 5 engines, 2 on the port side, 2 on the starboard side, and 1 in the middle at the bottom. You can see and near the fins. So it was designed to prove that Zeppelin technology would work. And that's why I've called this presentation the proving flights, because what they were trying to do with the Graf Zeppelin was to convince people that Zeppelin travel was safe and was technically superior. At this time, aircraft could not fly very far and could certainly not carry the payloads that an airship could carry. So here is a picture of the christening of the Graf Zeppelin. It was christened on July the 8th, 1928 by the Countess Brendenstein, who was the daughter of Count Zeppelin. And it's interesting, Germany put out stamps and a number of special events happened on the anniversaries of Count Zeppelin's birth. So a lot of things on Zeppelin history happened on July the 8th. The Graf Zeppelin was built with 33 tons of duralumin, which was a lighter form of aluminum and very strong. As I mentioned, it had 5 Maybach propeller engines. So Maybach was actually a company owned by Luftschiffbau Zeppelin. And the total gas volume was 3,700,000 cubic feet. It was 13 gas bags in that airship, and hydrogen was used as lifting gas. The Graf Zeppelin was the only airship that ever used blau gas as fuel. Blau gas was invented by a German scientist, and was really designed for cooking stoves and lanterns. The reason they tried it in the Graf Zeppelin was it weighed about the same as air. And so when you used the fuel, you just replaced it with air. And so you didn't have to let hydrogen or helium out of the balloons, which you normally did as an airship got lighter. You had to let out some of your lifting power, or you just kept going up in the air. So this was the only ship that used blow gas. Okay, so from conception, the Graf Zeppelin was designed to prove the feasibility of airships, as I said. And if you took away the weight of fuel for a normal flight, crew and equipment, the Graf Zeppelin could carry a net load of 15 tons, or 20 passengers and about 26,400 pounds of mail or freight over a distance of 6,250 miles. So whenever they were having a flight with the Graf Zeppelin, all of the weight was very carefully calculated. And if you see pictures of people doing passenger flights, they were weighed as well as their luggage. The first flight occurred on September the 18th, 1928, and Hugo Echner was the commander of that flight. 2 days after the first flight, Germany put out the first two of the world's Zeppelin stamps. You can see them here, and it's a picture of the Graf Zeppelin flying over the globe. As you can see, it's flying from Europe towards America. The picture on this page is actually a picture of them bringing out the Graf Zeppelin for the first time for its first flight. So you can see that it still has the big Z on the front of the command cubicle that hangs underneath. Where did I go back? Sorry, went too far. Yeah. So the first, it did 6 local flights, 3 test flights, and 3 one-day flights around Germany. And then the Graf Zeppelin began her first intercontinental flight on October the 11th, 1928. She carried 40 crew, 20 passengers who were all VIP and invited, and 66,000 pieces of mail on her maiden flight to America. Now, any mail that was carried on this flight has the MIT Luftschiff LZ-127 marking you can see on this picture. It actually, although it says on board, they were actually applied at the Friedrichshafen post office before the mail was loaded, because the post office on the airship was not yet operational. One of the reasons that the Zeppelin companies carried so much mail is they would negotiate special arrangements with the post offices. So the German post office would give the Zeppelin company 83% of the cost of postage used on the mail that was carried. So it was a very profitable part of their operation. And here's a picture of the New York Times on the day that the Zeppelin arrived at Lakehurst. So it actually, Echner was very careful about what he did with the airship, because he wanted to get the publicity needed to grow the technology. On the first flight, they actually, it was one of the few times that Echner did something reckless when he was in command of an airship. They approached a storm front, and he entered it at full speed. Normally he would have slowed down, but this time he went right in. And as you can see on the picture on the upper right, it ripped all of the skin off the stabilizer on the port side. So they put out a distress call, and they asked for crew that would be willing to try to repair the ship in flight. Hugo Echner's son is one of those 3 people you can see on that picture. They were able to replace, they carried enough spare material that they were able to actually repair the rip. They to do the repairs, they had to keep dropping down very low to the water and turning the motor off. So the airship was not moving forward very quickly. That also meant when the motors were turned off, the propellers didn't turn, and so there was no air contact. So people lost touch with the Graf Zeppelin, and so the newspapers were reporting the disaster and the crash. So actually, when the airship was able to get to America, they flew over Baltimore and Washington before going into Lakehurst, and it was greeted with huge crowds. The passengers, as I said, to the first flight were invited guests. They included Lady Grace Drummond Hay and U.S. Naval Officer Charles Rosendahl. If you're a Zeppelin fan, both those people are well known. Is there a question? Lady Grace Drummond Hay was a reporter for William Randolph Hearst newspaper chain. She was 22 when she married an 80-year-old British lord who passed away a couple of years after their marriage and left her very well off. So she spent a lot of her career writing and traveling all over the world on airplanes and airships. The cover you can see on the left here was from the Pan American flight in 1930, but the reason I've included it here is it's signed by Lady Grace Drummond Hay. She was considered one of the most famous women in her day. Charles Rosendahl was one of the U.S. leading airship officers in the U.S. Navy. He actually was in the back of the Shenandoah when it broke up, and they were able to under his command to balloon the stern section down to the ground without loss of anyone, although so many people were killed in the front of the Shenandoah. And he also commanded the Mekong. So he was in charge of the naval base at Lakehurst when Hindenburg crashed. So his name is rather well known. And on the return flight back to Germany, which was the first time they were selling tickets, it included a lady named Clara Adams. She was the first ticketed woman passenger on a transatlantic flight. She also was an aviation enthusiast. And the picture on the lower right is actually a 1934 schedule for the Zeppelins that was published in London. And it would tell people how long it would take you to fly to South America. But it is signed by Clara Adams, which is why I've included it. On the return flight to Germany, so the Graf Zeppelin carried 52,000 postcards and 50,000 letters. So aviation enthusiasts really loaded up the mail, and the U.S. Post Office, to promote the use of postage stamps, applied this, you can see rubber stamp, first flight airmail, United States to Germany, on every card and letter with a purple hand stamp. And somebody in the U.S. Post Office got to apply that to 104,000 pieces of mail. After coming back from America, I did a couple of small flights, and then the Zeppelin went back into the shed for about 7 or 8 weeks for maintenance and during the winter. And when it came out, it did a couple of small flights around Germany. And the first international flight that was well publicized was the Orient flight of 1929. And I included this quote that comes from Eckner's book. At the time, in the winter of 28-29, I had not yet comprehended the degree to which the interest of the great newspaper enterprises and of stamp collectors could be exploited to supplement the receipts from carrying passengers. So DELAG was a real airline. The idea was it was going to pay for the flights by selling tickets, but it costs so much to operate these airships, especially on international flights, that mail became a very important part of the revenue for DELAG. So there are a couple of cards here from the flight, the Orient flight, or the Holy Land flight of 1929. The upper one is a cover prepared by U.S. stamp dealer from New Jersey. Brain dead here. He was a specialist for A.C. Rossler, who was a specialist in airmail, but he produced covers and would have them on flights of both airships and airplanes and sell them to collectors. He also was arrested twice and charged and found guilty of making phony stuff. So a lot of A.C. Rossler material is kind of interesting. You have to be careful if it's real or not, but these are real. So the top one is an AC Rossler cover, and the other one is a stamp dealer from the Netherlands. Then a month later, the Graf Zeppelin conducted a 2-day flight over the Mediterranean Sea. And for the first time, it did official mail drops in Sevilla, Tangier, San Remo, Barcelona, and Rodolfsville, which was on the other side of the lake from Friedrichshafen in Germany. And the mail was given a regular cancellation at the Friedrichshafen post office, loaded on a ship, and any of the mail that was carried on the ship received this cachet that you can see from a rubber stamp on board. This piece of mail was a mail drop in Sevilla, and it has a Sevilla receiving mark on the back. Some of the Friedrichshafen mail has a machine cancel. First time that the Friedrichshafen post have used a machine cancel. I haven't got one of those yet, but they are worth more than the regular hand stamp because of the scarcity. Then on May 16th, the Graf Zeppelin set out for her first flight to the United States for 1929. On the first evening, 2 of the engines failed, and Eckner decided that he'd better take the airship back to Germany rather than to keep going to the United States. As the airship moved up the Rhone Valley, 2 more engines failed. So it only had 1 engine left at this point on one side of the Zeppelin. They were looking for a place to actually, for the lack of a better term, crash land on the ground, and France granted permission for it to land at one of the French air bases. So they were able to land it successfully with the 1 engine. And the mail it was carrying for the first flight had that interruption flight markings applied in red. You can see it on this card here that was originally supposed to go on the first flight. Again, it's interesting because France would not allow Germany to fly airships over its territory or use any of its bases because of the damage inflicted during World War I. And this was one of the only times that they allowed a German airship to land within French territory after the war. When it landed, it was a military base, so the crew were all put into secure facilities, and they were guarded by French soldiers. And the new engines had to be sent from the Zeppelin works in Friedrichshafen, so the Graf Zeppelin actually sat on French territory for about 2 weeks till they could replace the engines. Investigation later found that the chief engineer had adjusted the engines before they left on the flight, and it made a mistake when he did the changes to the propeller shafts. Here's 2 more cards just to show a 2 mark and a 4 mark. So one is a card on the left and one is a cover on the right with the proper postal marking. Again, these are AC Rossler covers. That's his that yellow Zeppelin mark is one of his cachets. And he would sell them and then have them delivered right to the people. So Lewis A. Waters of Syracuse, New York, was always a collector and had paid Rossler to have these carried on the airship and delivered to him. And these both have the interrupted flight markings. The cover has it on the front, and the postcard, you can't see it, but it's stamped on the back. So as they had to go back to Germany and have this repairs implemented after lifting off from France, they went back to Friedrichshafen. While all of this was happening, Hugo Eckner was trying to negotiate with countries and sponsors to have flights that would bring popularity and publicity to the Graf Zeppelin. So he wrote in his book, it was a task of the commercial department of the Zeppelin company to demonstrate the usefulness of the Zeppelin under all conditions throughout the world and to obtain experience in all of its zones. How better could this be done than a flight around the world? So on August the 1st, the Graf Zeppelin again left Friedrichshafen for Lakehurst, New Jersey. The post card here is not from my collection. It's I think one of the few things I'm showing that's not But this shows the route the Graf Zeppelin followed on the around the world flight. Now, if you ask a German, the flight started in Friedrichshafen, went to Lakehurst, and then came back to Friedrichshafen and went around to Tokyo, LA, and back to Lakehurst, and then back to Friedrichshafen. But Hearst, as the major financial sponsor, demanded that the flight start and end in the United States. So the August 1st flight to the United States was not considered part of the around the world flight to Americans. This card is from Friedrichshafen on that flight that was to go around the world, to go to Lakehurst and then back. It has markings on it. The markings above the cachet that says World Flight 1929 is applied by the post office in Friedrichshafen, and there's sorting marks. So this one says that it is going to be unloaded in Tokyo. Hearst gave them enough money to pay for about 80% of the flight. He had reporting rights everywhere except within Germany and Northern Europe, which Echner wanted the German press to have because of the support they had given the Zeppelin works. And then mail by collectors who could collect all of the different legs of the flight. There was enough mail that it actually paid for the rest of the flight. So the passengers who went on the around the world flight, their revenue actually generated a profit for DELAG. First flight they ran, it made a profit that was international. Now, the United States Post Office, again, had advertised this flight exceptionally strongly, and the Post Office applied that first round the world flight marking in the US to every cardinal letter that was to be loaded in Lakehurst and carried around the world. So it began on August 7th from Lakehurst and arrived back in Lakehurst on September the 4th. So the flight around the world took almost a month. As I mentioned before, it was from Lakehurst to Friedrichshafen, Friedrichshafen to Tokyo, Tokyo to Los Angeles, and Los Angeles to Lakehurst. In actual flying time, it took 12 days and 12 hours and 13 minutes to fly Lakehurst to Lakehurst. And this flight set a number of records, including the first passenger flight around the globe, the first non-stop Pacific flight that they flew from Tokyo to Los Angeles without stopping, and the fastest circumnavigation of the globe up to that time. So it was exceptionally well-known and well-publicized flight right around the world. And it was promoted and covered extensively. The interesting thing, the reason Tokyo was chosen as a destination on his flight was Tokyo had been a member of the Allies in the First World War, and their reparation from Germany was one of the Zeppelin sheds that had been taken apart in Germany and shipped to Japan and put together again. Of course, there was no need for it there, but they were able to use that for the storing the Zeppelin when it went around the world flight. So after that round the world flight in 1929, it conducted 14 more flights through Germany and Switzerland and European destinations like Spain and Netherlands before the winter overhaul. I'm including this card only because it is a handmade card, and it doesn't look that special, but the British at this time were creating their own imperial airship scheme, and they had the two ships in Cardington. So Echner was able to negotiate to bring the Graf Zeppelin to Cardington, and then the two air crews were allowed to look at each other's ships. This was before the R100 flew to Canada, and the Germans showed up in their nice uniforms, and the British had, overalls and stuff like that. And so before they went to Canada, the British decided the Germans had shown them up, so they gave everyone a naval-looking uniform who flew on the R100, so that their pictures would be more classy like the Germans. In 1930, the Graf Zeppelin flew its first Pan-American flight. So the flight was from Europe to South America, and then to North America, up to Lakehurst again, and then back to Germany. So Echner, as I mentioned, was an exceptionally intelligent businessman. He was able to convince a number of the post offices to issue special stamps that could be used on the mail to be carried on the Graf Zeppelin on that flight. And so you can see the 3 US stamps that are the rarest stamp issue the United States had of the 20th century. There is one of the overprinted Argentina stamps, and Germany put out the same design. They overprinted for the Pan American flight with what you see there, the condor, and then the phrase. So the flight went from Friedrichshafen to Spain, then Spain to Recife, which was where the Zeppelin shed was for Brazil. It actually then flew on to Rio de Janeiro for the first time, and it was held on the ground for 2 hours by 200 sailors from the Brazilian Navy, because there was nowhere to dock the ship. And then it took off, went back to Recife, and then up to the United States, and then back to Spain and to Friedrichshafen. The envelope on the top, on the right-hand side, is mail that was picked up in Sevilla, and that was the first flight that landed in Sevilla. And then the mail that was loaded in Recife for the flight to Lakehurst received the marking you can see, and this is one of the overprinted Zeppelin stamps, where it says Graf Zeppelin on that stamp, and that stamp is a semi-official. The Brazilian government actually allowed the Zeppelin company to print its own stamps and sell them in Brazil for mail that was to be carried on the Graf Zeppelin. This cover is actually autographed by Hugo Echner. One of my prides of my collection. The Pan American flight, the US Post Office again advertised it to push mail. And so they applied this diamond-shaped marking to every piece of mail that was loaded in Lakehurst. The US Post Office had decided, the Depression had already started. They figured out that selling Zeppelin stamps would raise an additional $10,000 for the US Post Office. So they printed 1 million of each of the 3 denominations. They also, to encourage people to buy them and include them in their collections, they announced that all of the stamps that were not sold within 6 weeks of the flight would be destroyed. The stamps could only be used on mail to be carried on the Pan American flight. Once that flight was done, you couldn't use the Graf Zeppelin stamps for anything else. But in 1930, there was not a lot of spare money around there. So of the 3 million stamps produced, they only sold 227,000 of them. And it became the rarest issue of the 20th century, as I mentioned. And most of the high values were used on covers by collectors. So almost all of the money that was raised by the US Post Office actually went to DELAG. So it was not a successful venture for the US Post Office Department. And as I mentioned before, Zeppelin were flown a lot around Germany so that the German people could see their aircraft. Hugo Echner made sure, because their contributions to help fund the Graf Zeppelin, that they showed her around Germany wherever they could. So on the around the world flight, from the Friedrichshafen to Tokyo, they flew over the Soviet Union, which meant they had to carry a member of the Soviet bureaucracy on board. And they wanted the airship to fly over Moscow. Echner was concerned there wasn't enough fuel to do that. So he stayed north of Moscow, and the Soviet Union took that as a slight. They made an official complaint to the German government. And so at President Hindenburg's request, the dirigible left for a short visit to Moscow in September 1930. And 100,000 people waited at the airport in Moscow to see it. And that was so indicative of so many of the flights would have 10 and 20,000 people to see the airship when it landed. Russia issued special stamps, and Echner convinced them to help pay for the flight. And it was supposed to be a stamp that was the achievement of the 5-year plan in 4 years. And they had the stamps already basically created. And so somebody added a Zeppelin to the plates and then they printed them. The Soviet government wanted to make sure it got its fair share. So you had to pay the regular airmail flight cost of an envelope, plus put the Zeppelin stamp on for mail carried on the Zeppelin. So although the DELAG got a big part of the Soviet Zeppelin stamp money, it was the Zeppelin's postage required within Russia to pay for itself. A couple of days after the Moscow flight, the Graf Zeppelin flew north over the Baltic Sea, again proving the technology in a less than ideal climate. It was supposed to land at Helsinki, but the very high winds prevented that. So they dropped mail at Riga, Tallinn, Helsinki, and Stockholm. And they dropped a rope down in Helsinki and picked up Finnish mail. This card is one that they picked up and carried on the flight. Sorry, no, this is a German card that was carried and dropped at Helsinki. And the stamp you see is the special Zeppelin stamp that Finland put out for this flight only. And it's, again, not a common stamp because it was only ever used for one flight. After that flight, there were a couple more flights around Germany, and then the Graf Zeppelin was put up for the winter. The first commercial flight of 1931, after two small test flights, was a 3-day flight to Hungary with a landing in Budapest. And as I mentioned, 20,000 people were waiting for this flight. They did a 1-day flight of passengers around Hungary. So they left Budapest and came back the next day. And then there was a flight back to Friedrichshafen. The Hungarian post office put out 2 stamps. You can see them at the bottom left, one for cards and one for covers. And then this card from the flight has the cachet applied on the Zeppelin, and it was mailed in Budapest. And so you can see the stamps are canceled with Budapest postal markings. And then in 1931, they did a second flight to the Middle East, starting on April the 9th. So again, totally different climates. It flew across the Mediterranean to Libya. It flew over Alexandria to Cairo. Now, the first time it went to the Holy Land, the Egyptian government, at the encouragement of the British government, refused to allow the Graf Zeppelin to fly over Egyptian territory. This time, it was welcomed into Egypt with open hands. The airship hovered above the Great Pyramid for about 30 minutes, supposedly 40 meters above the top of the pyramid. So the passengers could take pictures of that, and then went on to Palestine, where it flew over Jerusalem. It landed in Egypt and did a 1-day around Egypt flight. Echner got off the airship when it landed, and he had a session with the king, King Fahd, to try and sell Zeppelins to the Egyptian government, and then was picked up when the Graf Zeppelin came back to Egypt and went back to Friedrichshafen. The Egyptian post office overprinted the same stamp, but with 2 different values. And you can see there is a card on the top and a cover on the bottom. 100 mil and 50 mil were the 2 rates for covers and cards. And in 1931, again, Echner convinced a number of governments or post offices to issue stamps. Germany issued a 1 mark stamp. Now, Scott puts the 1 mark with the 2 and 3 as the first Zeppelin stamps, but actually one mark came 3 years later, and it was to use for cards and mail that were carried within Germany. Liechtenstein put out 2 stamps, a 1 franc and a 2 franc, and then Iceland overprinted 3 different values for Zeppelin stamps for that year for a flight that was to Iceland and back. Then in 1931, probably one of the most popular and well-known flights of the Graf Zeppelin, the passenger accommodations were pretty much stripped bare, and the airship did a flight up to the Arctic, where it did scientific research and measured a number of things that had never been measured before, like solar radiation and that in the Arctic. And then it landed on the water. There's a picture of it there from the boat coming out from the Malagan, a Soviet icebreaker that went up there to meet it, and they exchanged mail. And then the Graf Zeppelin flew that mail back. So the card you see here is a card from the polar flight, and it has the special markings to say it was carried on the icebreaker and then was loaded onto the Graf Zeppelin. Those are the Soviet stamps for the flight, and they did them both imperf and perf. And then you can see the German stamps are issued for their polar flight, 1 mark and 2 mark up above. This postcard, actually, when I bought it both because of what it is, but it actually shows the Amber Room in the Winter Palace, which 10 years later was dismantled by the Germans after they captured St. Petersburg, and no one has ever seen the room since. Then in 1931, about 10 months after the crash of the British airship R101, the Graf Zeppelin made her 2nd flight to England, and she landed in London. It did a flight around the city and nearby counties. And really, this flight occurred because Hugo Echner hoped the British government would decide to continue to promote airships, but they would buy airships manufactured by Luftschiffbau Zeppelin. That never happened, but it was a good try. And I actually always liked this cachet that was applied on board. So basically, by the end of 1931, the proving flights were pretty much done. And the plans by DELAG were to put the Graf Zeppelin into regular service to South America, which started in August of 1931. You could get from Friedrichshafen to Recife in about 3 days. You couldn't do that in 6 days on an ocean liner. So much quicker. Businesses would pay extra to have their communication carried. And again, Zeppelin negotiated treaties with a number of post offices that they would provide special Zeppelin stamps for mail to be carried on the Graf Zeppelin between South America and Europe. And I mentioned that Hugo Echner and the Zeppelin company are very smart about promoting the value of the Graf Zeppelin. This cover was carried from Friedrichshafen to Recife, which they call Pernambuco. And in German and in Portuguese, this hand stamp says that the Graf Zeppelin will wait 5 days in Brazil before returning. So you could speed your answer to the mail that you received by sending it right back to the Graf Zeppelin to be carried on the eastbound flight. So regular service, as I mentioned, in 1932, they did 9 South American flights, 8 in 33, 12 in 34, 16 in 35, and 13 in 36. And the regular flights, of course, people have written whole books on them and how many pieces of mail were carried in every one, but the cachets and everything tend to look very similar. They were also, though, the airship was also used for special flights. So the Nazi government came to power in Germany in 1933, and Dr. Goebbels requisitioned the Graf Zeppelin for a flight for his first meeting with the fascist government in Rome. So he used the Graf Zeppelin to go from Friedrichshafen to Rome. And here's a special cachet that was applied to cover. This one has San Marino stamps. And again, a San Marino overprinted stamp was used. The cover in the middle was the flight to Chicago World's Fair in 1933. The Graf Zeppelin hadn't been back to the United States since its flight to the 3 continents. And so this was the first flight back to the US at the request of the operators of the Chicago World's Fair. And then the one you see on the far right is the same flight back to Chicago. This one's picked up in Chicago, mailed, and this is what the US called the baby Zepp, the 50-cent airmail stamp. And showing the cachet shows the Graf Zeppelin over the century of progress, and that's applied again by the US Post Office. So this picture is one of the engine cars from the Graf Zeppelin. They were on the return from the second South American trip of 1937 when the crew was informed that the Hindenburg had crashed at Lakehurst. They didn't tell their passengers till they, of course, landed at Friedrichshafen, which took another day and a half, and everyone was disembarked. The German government declined to issue permits for passenger flights after that. So the Graf Zeppelin did one more flight to Frankfurt am Main. She was hung in a hangar and deflated. And for about a year was, for about a year and a half actually, was on display as a tourist attraction. You could pay a few marks to go see it and go on board, hung in this hangar. In 1940, upon orders of the Reichsmarshal Göring, it was dismantled, and the metal was required for the German aircraft manufacturing efforts for the war. The Graf Zeppelin was the most successful rigid airship ever built. She flew over 1 million miles, and that was the first aircraft ever to fly over 1 million miles. She carried 13,110 passengers and 106,000 kilograms, or 235,000 pounds of mail and freight. She flew a total of 17,177 hours, or 717 days, without injuring a passenger or a crewman. And so I'm going to just wrap up with this. If you are at all interested in collecting aerophilately for rigid airships, you can collect aerophilately. If you don't collect aircraft, but you collect other things, you can do balloons, or you can do semi-rigid, or you can do rigid. And the German Zeppelins were rigid airships. You can collect the stamps, or the postal history, or you can collect Cinderellas. You can collect by country, or airship, or routes, or the cachets, or passengers or crew, or even special flights. I mean, I've certainly seen exhibits on the flight to Rome. I've seen exhibits on the first flight to the United States. I mean, people can collect all sorts of things. And there's lots of reference material available if you're at all interested in Zeppelin. Major catalogs include Seeger, which is the one shown on the bottom. It has not been printed for years, but it is still out there and available on the used market. Michel puts out Zeppelin catalogs every few years, German about every 3 years, and English every 10. And then the Frost Special Airship Mail and Postcard, it does special aircraft as well as airships, and it does the Zeppelin, it does the Goodyear blimps, all in the catalog, and that's a very useful one, and that is in English. So thank you very much.
I have a question. The 3 US, the 65, the $1.30, and 260.
Yes.
Were those for special rates, or what was the rationale for those three rates?
They were special rates. So to fly a US card or cover on one leg of the flight cost 65 cents. To fly it across the ocean, To carry it 2 legs was $1.30, and it was $2.60 for a cover to go around the world from Lakehurst to Los Angeles or Lakehurst back to Lakehurst. So those
Thank
rates covered parts of it.
I was wondering how much money that would be today for those stamps, and I went, of course, everything's answered on Google. So in 1930s, $1 today is $17.75. So the $2.60 stamp would be something like $46. So you could see why collectors, instead of the general public, maybe were going after these stamps. You had to have deep pockets.
And it, like I said, this was done in 1930, and so the Depression has already started. A lot of people have lost their jobs. The tickets around the world were $5,000 a person at a time when the average US income was $120 a year. So you can see that you had to have very deep pockets to actually fly on the Graf Zeppelin.
So
And a
it was
number of the passengers,
basically,
of course, were pressed on this flight.
it was somewhat like the Concorde of the day.
Yes.
Well, I think, Les, you've almost
Sorry,
got your...
I'll do one other thing. So Gene,
Yeah.
Gene asked me one time why I collected Zeppelin stuff. So I had a history teacher in high school, and I went to a very small high school. So you had the same history teacher through 4 grades. You had the same geography teacher through 4 grades. I mean, the whole school had like 400 kids, the whole high school. And so I had a German or an Austrian history teacher. And he had actually been trying to escape from Austria when it was annexed by Germany in 1938. And he was in Italy, and his Austrian passport was no longer valid because the country had ceased to exist. And so he had to go, the Italians made him go back to Germany, and he was drafted right away into the Luftwaffe ground support. His first job, so when Goering ordered the airships dismantled, he ordered both the Graf Zeppelin and the new Graf Zeppelin, what many people call the second Graf Zeppelin, but it was named after the first airship because it had been retired already, and the keel of the next one, which was laid and being made in Friedhof, and he ordered them taken apart. The Zeppelin workers refused. They would not take apart their airships, so the Luftwaffe ground personnel had to go in and take them apart. And this was Mr. Bacher's first job as a member of the Luftwaffe was to take apart the Graf Zeppelin and Graf Zeppelin II. They were both hung in the same hangar in Frankfurt am Main. And he had these nice little black and white pictures that were about 1.5 by 1.5 inches of them dismantling the Graf Zeppelin. And I was fascinated by that. And that's kind of what always made me want to find out more. So I dedicate the collection to Alfred Bacher.
Very cool.
Are you writing this up for the anthology? It's almost done.
Yeah, I know. And you know what? I've got a couple of things I'd like, but my life is absolutely crazy because I'm helping a friend downsize, and then I'm in Iceland for a couple of weeks next month. And then the scout season starts up again. So I am like, I need one more year. I have started an article on the financial operations of the Graf Zeppelin, which is really something I found fascinating. So,
okay, if there aren't any more questions, I want to thank, on behalf of the Society, I want to thank Les for a really excellent presentation. I'm sure that Les is going to make a great contribution to the Society over the time that he's over the years. And this is a huge start. I don't collect Zeppelin mail myself, though I do have one Zeppelin cover, but Les obviously has a lot more. And he's explained things with great clarity and made a very interesting story out of the whole episode, right from the start around the turn of the century, right through to the dismantling of the Graf Zeppelin by his esteemed history teacher, who maybe he actually kept a few bits and pieces, I don't know. If he did, I hope he passed them on to Les. Anyway, thank you, Les, very much.
the reason he ended up in Canada was he was part of the ground crew in North Africa. And when Rommel left and they surrendered, he was brought to Canada. He was up in Kitchener for 2 years as a prisoner of war. And he liked Canada so much, he came back after the war and settled here.
Oh, that's very good. Anyway, thank you very much indeed on behalf of the Society. We really enjoyed it.
Thank you.